Society, and Layla.
I'm Layla. I'm the Vice President of the History Society, and we're here to introduce Dr. Hooton and Dr. Pierce on their new books that they've written.
Yes. Dr. Jason Pierce's book is called The Daily Life in American West, and Layla.
I have Dr. Hooton's book, Almost All Aliens, and they're going to talk about it.
It's back there.
It's back there.
Yeah,
in giant
size. This is the second book I've written, but it was a lot different than the first book I've written. This is kind of intended for a general audience, especially for libraries to have, maybe use in classrooms, those kinds of things. So it's not quite a textbook, but it's more like a textbook than, say, the first book I wrote, which was based on a lot of research in archives. And so one of the things about books, right, is there are different kinds of books, right? We have fiction books and novels, and a lot of student papers, I see you guys call everything a novel. It's only a novel if it's, fictitious with fictitious characters and things like that, right? And so nonfiction books are obviously different, but not all nonfiction books are the same kind of book. And so what this book is what's sometimes called a synthetic work, and that means I didn't go through a bunch of archives and things like that to find the information for this book like I did in my first book. Instead, I used a lot of other stuff that's been published to kind of create a new synthesis, right? So it's so the scope of the book is basically covering the 19th century, and what the publisher wanted, because this is part of a larger series they do called Daily Life in fill in the blank, right? Daily Life in Ancient Rome, Daily Life in they have a whole bunch of them, right? And so they have a kind of format they want, and they want to try to create a kind of engaging history, right? Because if you talk about wars and presidents and all that kind of stuff, it's really important, but they want a more personable kind of on-the-ground approach. And so that was kind of what I was trying to do, and so it was a good excuse to basically use all the stories I like to tell in class and stick them into a book. So all of my greatest hits are here, So, for example, a couple of stories I love to tell is the time George Armstrong Custer shot his own horse in the head accidentally.
That's an important thing to add.
Yes, it was accidentally at full gallop. And that was a problem. But yeah, I'll take the U.S. West class to tell you. Another one, talked a lot about the Oregon Trail, because the Oregon Trail is really neat, a lot of fun. There was a video game about it even a long time ago, yeah. And so, those kinds of things, right? What's it like to live in a mining camp in the 1860s? What's it like to be on the Oregon Trail? Another one of my favorite stories is lots of people and animals died on the Oregon Trail, right? Or if you've played the game, you know that that's what happens.
Dysentery,
dysentery especially, yeah. So, but this is a true story. So this group of kids is going on the Oregon Trail with their parents. Mostly you walked when you did the Oregon Trail. People don't realize that. You start in Independence, Missouri in March or April, and you walk to Oregon and get there by October. And so at a walking pace, you got a lot of time on your hands, right? So these kids are along the Platte River, and they come on a dead ox that has died, and it's starting to decay, and it's all filled with gas and stuff. So kids are kids, right? And kids, no matter the situation, do kid stuff. So these kids decided to do was use the dead ox as a trampoline. So they start jumping on the trampoline, bouncing on and off of it. Well, this one kid who's a little bigger than the other kids wants to show off, because that's a natural thing kids do, right? So he gets a running start, jumps up through the air, lands on the ox, but he's exceeded the tension of the ox, and so right into the guts of the ox he goes, right? So yeah, memorable story, fun story. And so that was the kind of stuff I tried to bring into this book, is like, what's it like to do all of these things, right? In a kind of ground level kind of view. So that's what my book is.
Mine is not a traditional book either, but for a very different reason. So Almost All Aliens is about immigration, race, and colonialism in American history. And part of the thing with this book is it's a second edition, which is something you might see on a lot of textbooks, or you might see something that says revised edition. So the story of this is I wrote it with 2 other people. These 2 people right here, that is Paul Spickard, who was my graduate advisor, and Francisco Beltran, who was a year below me in grad school, and we did a lot of work together and so forth. And essentially, this guy right here, Paul Spickard, when I was in graduate school, he was working on the starting to work on the second edition of this book. He got some money from the publisher to have some graduate students help him with some research and start organizing things, right? So he invited the 2 of us to help him with some of the research and start digging through a lot of the material he had. And by the time we finished with 2 quarters, so 20 weeks worth of work, he said, you guys got to be on the book. Because not only did we read through a lot of the material, but we gave him a lot of ideas for directions the book could go. And he said, look, this needs more voices. This needs more kind of specialties. And so he signed us. This picture was taken the day we signed the contract in his office for the book. And some books, if you see multiple authors, there's a primary author and then secondary authors. And those secondary authors maybe did a little less work or only did 1 chapter or something like that. That's not the case with this book. He wrote the first edition, but for the second edition, we didn't just update the last chapters, we actually updated the entire book, and myself and Dr. Beltran went through and added our kind of voices and some new analysis and some new language to every single chapter. Because we didn't want the last couple chapters that were updated to just sound like a brand new thing. And so the new book is, it is, some of it's the same as the original, but there's a lot of new things. Even if there's slight tweaks, the slight tweaks are meant to kind of adjust some of the framing. So this is the first edition. It's giant. For those of you who are old enough to know what phone books are, it kind of looks like a phone book. We call this the phone book as a joke because it's huge and it's black and yellow. And in case you don't believe me, it's huge. That's a first edition. And part of the reason it's so big is it has appendices and the footnotes are insane. And it's just the whole book has a lot of material that no other book has. So for example, for a couple years, or not a couple years, for a couple months, a couple years ago, the information for census data on immigration that's on like the INS website and stuff disappeared for months. And at that point, our book was the only thing published that had all of that material in it. It was not accessible on federal, this was like 3 years ago or 4 years ago. It was not accessible on any kind of federal site or anything like that. And so we've got appendices that break down all kinds of different information and kind of put them in charts, and it's really the only place that has all of that information in one location. And it's got all kinds of other stuff too. The new one looks smaller. It's because all that stuff's online now. We put the footnotes. How we were able to argue to the press that we want to add more is we said, let's put all the footnotes, all the appendices, all that stuff online so that it's available to everyone, and we can add a little more and, oh, by the way, make the book a little smaller. And so I'm not going to drop this one because it's my baby and I love it, but I can tell you it's not as loud when we drop it. So part of the thing that the first edition does and the second edition does too is this is kind of a textbook. Much like Dr. Pierce's is, in that it wasn't written as a textbook. So the first edition was not meant to be an upper division textbook. It wasn't meant to do that kind of thing. But it's really the only book that does what it does. And there were a lot of teachers who liked how accessible the book was, how it was broken down, and they ended up using it as a textbook anyway. Press ended up printing more copies of it. That's why they started asking for a second edition. And so one of the things we tried to do for the second edition is it still doesn't entirely sound like a textbook, but we tried to make it even more accessible to students. So the thing that this book does is prior to when the first edition came out in like 2004, 2005, most immigration books focused on a model. So the immigration, one of the immigration models is the Ellis Island model, right? Folks who come to the U.S. through Ellis Island have this specific focus, this specific experience. Or there was the U.S.-Mexico borderlands model, right? Everyone who comes across the border has one experience. There's these very specific, and it's not just social scientists, but historians were using these models too. And there was this kind of assumption that these models applied to everybody. And part of what this book talks about is, hey, here's these models, and they can be very helpful to a point. But the immigration experience is a very kind of unique experience to each individual person. It depends on where you're coming from, where you're going to, what time period is, what everything is happening in the world, what's happening in the US, and so forth. And so part of what the book tries to do is recognize that there are similarities across groups or across time periods, but also is trying to bring out that everyday person kind of experience. And part of how it does that is the chapters are chronological, but they're also broken into sections based on where people are from. And sometimes it's broader categories, sometimes it's smaller categories, but the inherent thing behind it is in the title. It's race and colonialism is behind the conversation about immigration, and that is something that is a common factor. And no one had said that before. In immigration history, there wasn't a book that placed race at the center of the entire conversation, not just for one group of people, but to talk about immigration broad scale. And that's why so many instructors who teach race and ethnicity and immigration started using the book, is because it was highly accessible and it placed immigration at the center. And so what the new edition did primarily is it updated everything from like 2004, 2005, so we went from that time period to the first 100 days of Biden's presidency. So we were writing the book during COVID, during everything that happened from 2004 up through. And it was updating all the new scholarship that had come out in immigration history, which is a lot, because it is in some ways a synthesis. But we were also updating it with all the news and all the everything and trying to condense it. And to be honest, the new chapters were over 150 pages at first, because we were trying to, and that was the first condensed version, and then we kept making it smaller, and then we made it smaller, and then we got it down to like 40. But to give you an idea, I brought some show and tell. So part of the process is, this was 3 people writing this thing, right? And part of the dynamic of this is my grad advisor is a pack rat when it comes to research. And so from the moment the first edition came out until we joined the project, and even after then, anytime something would happen, he would print an article or 3 out and stick them in a box in his office for 10 plus years. So this is just my box of research. That was the culled version that he mailed to me, organized by chapter. This is just the stuff that was printed. This doesn't even include the online stuff. So it's a lot. And what we ended up doing, I'm sorry, I'm taking way longer than you.
What did that cost? Yeah.
He shipped this from California. So
There goes your royalty check.
Right? What royalty check? We'll talk about that in a minute. So part of what happened is we had to figure out, how do we get these 3 voices all to come together, right? Because Dr. Spicker does a whole bunch of stuff, but he primarily started doing Asian American history and kind of Asian immigrant history as well. For those of you who don't know me, I do African American history and U.S.-Mexico borderlands and Mexican American history and comparative race and ethnicity in the U.S. and migration stuff. And Dr. Beltran does primarily kind of Chicano movement stuff, but he taught a little bit in Asian American studies and did a little bit with Black studies, civil rights, that type of thing. So 3 pretty wide-ranging interests, but different interests. And so we all got together in Tahoe in summer of, I believe it was 2019, and we got the 10 bankers boxes worth of stuff. My grad advisor drove it up to his cabin in Tahoe, and we spread everything out. We had folders for each chapter and said, okay, what do we do? And this is what that looks like. Can you all see that? So that is his cabin. We had 3 tables. this size. And each of those file folders isn't just a chapter, it's individual, so that's all the new books that had come out in like a 6-year period. That's all the write-ups of them. So there's all kinds of, so this is all stuff about DNA and immigration, for example, and that's that little folder. I didn't know that Francisco took this picture until like 3 days ago. But this was one of the other tables, and we had everything spread out everywhere, and we were just filtering through everything and seeing what we wanted, what we didn't. And at one point we went through and said, okay, what is the shape of the new book? We're paper people, in case you didn't notice. So we then had to like put this all on paper so we could like type it so we could all share it. But this is what we ended up having. This is just the last like chapter and a half or 2 chapters, but this is kind of the, okay, what does this look like? And there's a bunch of scratch outs and stuff because we're figuring out, okay, this is section number 1 and this is section number 2 and this is what this all looks like. And that would, and then, after 2019, some more stuff happened and we talked about it and went, yeah, that doesn't actually change the shape. So apparently we did something right, because the shape of the book didn't really change, even though a lot of things were drastically changing with COVID and political stuff, and there's just a lot going on. And so that ended up being kind of a big part of the task for this book, was really figuring out, okay, how do we integrate 3 voices and do all this stuff? And then we were writing it from 3 different states the whole time. And so that's part of the reason we're all very proud of this book.
Physical states or mental states?
Yes. There might have been some alcohol involved too. But yeah, it's a different kind of a book for sure. But we thought it was very important, and it was very important to get it right. And so we spent so much time on this book, but it was because it was very important to get it right, and especially because we knew it would be in libraries, we knew students would be reading it, right? And so it's making sure that you do the work and you do it right. And I've talked a lot. Do you want to talk more?
Well, I think that's cool. It's kind of cool to see the pictures and things and think about how this is organized. And when we have you guys do papers, a lot of times you're like, why are we doing research papers, right?
I'm just going to make this go to the black screen.
Yeah, so research papers are really just a sort of smaller version of this, right? And so if you develop those skills to do a research paper, then really a book is just a research paper on steroids, right? That is just lots of stuff,
steroids. Yeah.
So, it's learning those skills, because, sometimes people will be like, why do we have to do this, right? Well, it is a great way to learn those skills, right? It's like the Karate Kid when he waxes the cars all the time, right? And then suddenly is a black belt in karate, right?
Suddenly.
Same sort of
That's
thing.
totally
right?
how these things work.
That's exactly how it works. It's a totally on-point analogy. So I think, developing those skills, a research paper has a thesis. Well, generally so does a book, right? And then, you marshal your evidence, right, to support your argument. And so a book is just really a big scale version of that. Whereas you might have paragraphs in a research paper, maybe you have chapters in a book. And so it's a different size critter, but it's still a similar critter, right?
And even in a synthesis, there's still arguments. I mean, one of your arguments in that book is that daily life in the West was complicated, it was hard, it was challenging, and that it's also important to look at that history because it's there, right? And it's important to know individual life experiences. And like I said, this book, I mean, the argument is very simple. Race needs to be at the heart of immigration conversations. And that models work until they don't, and they're helpful, but maybe not, depending on who you're talking about. And so, I mean, those are pretty simple arguments, but they're vitally important. Yeah. I think
so. So what kinds of things did you change from the first edition to the second edition? It was more than just updating where the first book had ended. So
some of it, there was a lot of new scholarship that we were able to add, which was awesome. And sometimes it was literally a sentence. Was the addition, right? But we were able to add a footnote that was like this big with all the new things that had come out. One of the biggest changes, and the one thing that Dr. Spicker did on his own is he wrote the preface to the new edition. So for second editions, I guess it's worth mentioning, most of the time, if there's a second or a revised edition, it comes out for one of two reasons. Either there's new stuff to add, or the book is so pivotal to the field that they bring in a big scholar to write like a foreword and then publish it again, most of the time in paperback, to try to get more people to buy it. So with this one, it was updating it, but there's a preface that it's kind of like an introduction, but it's more of a here's why this book happened, here's why this book matters, outside of just the argument. And so he wrote the preface to the second edition, and one of the things he said is he didn't expect the first edition to kind of have the life it did, and so some of it is it was pretty readable before, but readability. But the other thing was the first edition tried to kind of look into the future. I think the last chapter was projecting the future, and it was thinking about, as of like 2004, what's the world like and what's the possible future for immigration history, or possible future for American immigration, knowing what we know about the history and using it as kind of a lesson, a guide. How do we think about the future? And what happened was drastically different than what was in that chapter. Because it was a very hopeful chapter. It was a very welcoming chapter. It was about, hey, you know, here are the possibilities for what experiences can exist for immigrants, right? And what came to pass was drastically different. And so one of the things we did in this edition is we said, look, we are not going to do that. We're not going to try to guess what the future is going to be like, because frankly, that's not what historians do, and there's a reason we're bad at it. We look at the past, right? We don't read tarot cards. But we do try to say, here's why the recent present looks like it does. And it's a different kind of a monster, but that was a big kind of adjustment, was... and some of it also was, one of the things that Dr. Beltran and I suggested is there were a lot of like pop culture references or present day references that were really good in like 2003. But since it's used as a textbook, most students don't know who like Pat Buchanan is, for example. He had a quote from that, and it hit really good in 2004, and some of the students are like, who the heck is that? Yes, that's why that's no longer in the book. It is for that reason. And so we instead tried to, even if we were making those references, give more of the context of why those references are helpful. And that was another thing that changed. And frankly, we talked a little more about white supremacy. And the role that plays in immigration conversations, and in immigration policy. Which is why when I say things happened, let's say in 2020, we went back and looked, and we were working on stuff, and we went back and looked at it. Yeah, no, it's the conversation that we were making in the book doesn't change. So that's another thing, is the last chapter is focused on white supremacy as an agent of kind of not only immigration policy, but how immigrants are talked about and talked to in the U.S. And that was in the first edition, but it's much more there. Yeah. I have a question for you.
Oh, okay, yes.
Is there a story that you love that did not make it into the book?
Oh, that's a good one.
Since your book's about stories.
Yes, since I like to include stories. You know, I want to say there is, but now that you put me on the spot, I can't remember what it was.
I stumped him.
You did, in my own book, which I haven't read. I farmed it all out to, no, I'm just kidding. But now, let's see. That does happen. In fact, my old advisor used to say that he knew his book manuscript was ready when he had finally taken out his last favorite line. Right?
That is so true.
Because,
we had to cut all the good lines.
Yeah, you want to put, I really want this, and it just doesn't fit. You keep trying to shoehorn it in, and you're like, it just doesn't work. And so,
especially when the editor says, does this really matter for that chapter? And you go, yes, it does. And then, does it? No.
Oh, I think the one I took out is from a book I really like, a memoir this lady wrote. She was a mining engineer's wife in Telluride, Colorado, before the Hollywood people were there, when it was a mining camp. And she talked about how all her silverware kept disappearing. This was in a mining camp at 12,000 feet in the middle of winter. And there's nobody around, right? And all her stuff, she'd be doing the dishes, and where are my forks? And so she finally realized there was a pack rat in the ceiling that kept stealing all of her stuff and hiding it. And then finally, when spring came, they go up in the attic, and there's this, like, everything they own is up there. This pack rat is stolen.
Okay, how big is this rat?
Well, it must have been a good size rat.
I mean, I'm just trying to.
But I thought it was a cool story, but I couldn't figure out where to put it in there. So,
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that is one I took out.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, right? It tells you about the life. How do you live at 12,000 feet in the Rockies? When the only way to get supplies in and out is on a mule train that goes through, avalanche chutes, and you can't. Oh no, I'm out of flour, right? You can't just run over to Walmart and get some more, right? It has to be shipped up, and so.
Oh no, my silverware
My
is
silverware
being
is
stolen.
gone, yeah, and so
It can't be anyone because there's no one
here.
here.
Yeah,
That's pretty good.
So it's-
Yeah,
But yeah, so that one I think I ended up taking out, and
that's sad.
yeah, but in terms of like sources, so while this is a synthetic work, and I did draw off a lot of books and things that had been done, I also used a lot of memoirs because of course memoirs from the time period, letters, those kinds of things are probably one of the best ways to get a on-the-ground sense of what things were like. And Americans in the 19th century were very cognizant that what they were doing was, amazing. There was a sense of mission that Americans had in the 19th century, right? We talk about manifest destiny, right? This concept that's trotted out by a guy named John O'Sullivan, who's a newspaperman writing during the Mexican-American War to justify the Mexican-American War, where he's saying Americans are destined for greatness, right? And Americans did have that sense of mission, and so they were. When you, for example, went on the Oregon Trail, you knew this was a big deal, and this would be something that you would remember the rest of your life. And that you would tell your kids and your grandkids and all that kind of stuff about. So they were very likely to do things like keep diaries. A lot of Americans back in the day kept diaries, but a lot more, proportionally, it seems like a lot more did on the Oregon Trail because they knew this was a big monumental thing. And I'm going to write this down, right? And so those are great sources for all sorts of things, people's attitudes, right? This terrible fear of Indians, which is palpable in a lot of these things. But the reality is the Indians actually helped Oregon Trail pioneers far more than they attacked them, Indians would tell, you don't want to go cross the river there, go up that way, there's a better crossing, right? And they would help them, provide food sometimes, things like that. Yet there was this fear of Indians, and so you can see that, reflected in these diaries and things like that. And mining, the mining camp experience, same sort of thing. People knew that this was kind of like nothing that had ever happened before, and so they would write a lot of letters and things like that back to their family members, talking about the gold fields and how hard it is to live in some middle of nowhere California, and butter costs $6 a stick in 40s, 50s. Yeah, I mean it's like $100 today or something, and that, there's these kind of interesting, kind of anecdotes and stories and things. And so I worked in a lot of those kinds of things. So you can do that, right? Because these things have been published and are available. Poems of Chinese immigrants coming into the United States. There's a great book on that, and so a lot of published poems where you get a sense of what life was like for immigrants coming to China, looking first for hoping to find enough money that they could build up a big nest egg to go back home and kind of change their family's fortunes. And but they face a huge amount of discrimination, and we can talk some more about it if you want. But they wrote back about often how disappointed they were and how the dreams back in China of the gold mountain, right? That's what they call California, and by extension the United States. This land of amazing opportunity is not a land of opportunity for people like me because of all the various hurdles and things like that are placed in front of them. So you get a sense of their stories, right? And so you can it's all kind of stuff I did.
Yeah, we've got, that's an overlap between our two books, because obviously Chinese immigration is a big part of the American immigration story, and that's actually one of those commonalities that you see across immigration, is that there's expectations, and then there's reality, and sometimes the expectations and reality don't match up in a bunch of different ways, not just, I wanted this big thing and didn't get it, but I expected this and got this, and sometimes it's a happy story, and sometimes it's not a happy story, and sometimes it's not happy or sad, but it just is. But a lot of times, even though what that looks like is different for different people, that's one thing we try to do too, is a lot of people assume that that's a book about policy, and it perhaps is. You have to talk about immigration policy to talk about immigration, but we tried as much as possible to bring out stories of people, right? Yeah. And the different experiences, and because that's what's interesting.
Yeah.
Or at least that's what we think is interesting.
Yeah, that's what makes history interesting. Because as you guys are teachers and things like that, you'll get, I hate history. History's so boring. It's just names and dates. And then as teachers of history, you go, well, it's so much more than that, right?
Yeah.
People love historical movies, and things like that, or now true crime, right? Is the big thing. Just kind of a sort of weird, history, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's...
I buy that argument.
Yeah, I mean... Yeah, I guess. We'll run with it. And so, people are interested in stories about people, right?
Yeah.
And history is about people. And so if we teach it as boring and dull, then I think that's on us. I think there's so much we can do to try to make that come alive. And that was kind of the goal. I'm sure it's still boring. My dad said he started it, but he hadn't finished it yet. So, because that's one other thing that happens with the book is that you have to send a copy to all of your family members. Yeah.
I think maybe one more thing we can talk about, and then we can open to Q&A.
Yeah,
Speaking of making history and come alive and all that, you want to talk about money?
Yes.
Give us money.
Yeah.
No.
So
Well, yes.
Stephen King made a lot of money. J.K. Rowling is a billionaire, apparently, for Harry Potter. You do not get $1 billion to write a book about history. You're lucky. You get, I think my contract is, well, let's see. For a hardback, it's 10%. So if you do sell a book, which it hasn't sold very many,
it's only been out for
It's been out since June or July.
Yeah.
So at the most, you might get as much as $6 a copy. Maybe I'll sell.
That's high.
Really high.
That's pretty good, right?
That's
Usually
good.
it's not that high.
I'm not getting
Well, it's based on the
$6 for
hardback.
that.
So if you get 10%, of $62, you get $6.20.
Oh, it's $60.
But- Yeah, so that's the other thing. That's why
Mine's cheaper.
we had talked about having a table
Yeah.
selling them, and I was like, I don't feel like charging you guys $62. That's a bit excessive. The target market for my book is libraries, right? In fact, you can actually read my book. It's in the library electronically, because that's the future of books. But anyway, which is an interesting point, how electronic things disappear, as you were mentioning, and when you have a physical book, it doesn't disappear. But anyway, that's a side note. But so you're, and maybe I'll sell a few dozens of copies or something. So you're not going to make very much money. And then the longer a book is out and when it changes into different forms, you get even less money. And so you're probably not going to get rich writing history books.
I mean, even for a textbook, in quotes, or a book that's used in an upper level class, and mine, we're splitting between 3 authors, right? So, and one thing my grad advisor insisted on, and I was not going to say no, and I do appreciate it, is he said, we're splitting the royalties 3 ways, even though he wrote the first edition entirely by himself. He said, and the idea is Dr. Beltran and I are going to take over the 3rd edition whenever it's time for that, and we will do a majority of the work for that one. And we did a lot of the work for this one too, and so he said, the royalty should be 3 ways. It's going to be even, which was really awesome, because that's not normally how that works. But even with that, I mean, we're going to make, I don't know, maybe $50 a year.
Yeah, that's about right.
Maybe. Well, if it's being used in classes, because it's got a 5,000 print run, which is a lot for an academic book. So I mean, maybe $50 a year
The best
for
I
the
did,
first couple of years. Maybe.
The best I did with my first book was $300 in 1 year.
What?
Yeah, and I gave it back to the publisher, but that's a different story. So that's what is that? Well, I have children. That's a pair of shoes. Because, I need the Nike Air something another 16 Kevin Durant edition. Okay, how much is that? right? So I could buy my kid, I could keep my kid in shoes. For
And
1
we're
year.
not saying this to complain, by the
Yeah.
way, but students
It's
think,
the reality, yeah.
oh, like my book is going to be one of the sources for the immigration class I'm teaching next semester. I'm not doing that because I want to make money. I'm not going to make much money on it. I'm doing it because it's really the best book that does the thing that it does. And oh, by the way, I'm going to see if the library can get a unlimited use copy for everyone to use so that no one has to buy the book, because I don't care about making money on this thing. That's not the reason either of us, I
Right,
don't think,
yeah.
did this. Is if we were going to make money, we would, try to be J.K. Rowling or something. We would not be academics, just to be clear. But it's not about the money, and it never really is.
It's about the passion,
Yeah.
the love.
Yeah. The teaching, the
Yes.
story. But it really is about, it kind of is. When you hear academic authors say it's a labor of love, we are not joking. It really is a labor of love. Yeah. And we just want to be honest with you
And
guys
if you
about that.
if you figure out your returns, and then your hourly wage, you
Oh.
probably actually lose money.
I definitely lost money off this book. But that's a whole other story.
All right. But should we
Questions?
Open it up to questions.
Q&A? Yes.
Okay, the story you told about the kids jumping on
Mhm.
the ox,
Mhm.
who recorded that?
Remember, repeat the question.
Oh yes, So Layla asked, who recorded that?
The story about the kids
The
jumping
kids
on
jumping on the ox. That was, I believe, from a letter, and I can't remember if it was a family member or.
That
or
had
who.
to be a dad.
Yeah, that you could you
It
well.
was like, guess what my son did?
Yeah, can you imagine going to your parents and being like,
Ta-da!
"Hi, I'm covered in ox guts," you know? Yeah.
You almost made me spit take.
Yeah. So, yeah, but it's those kind of interesting anecdotes that people remember.
Yeah.
There are a lot of less fun anecdotes. For example, one of the common strategies on the trail. Now, the trail is not just a road. You just kind of went wherever you wanted, but it kind of followed a general path. And so a lot of people died on the Oregon Trail, particularly, almost exclusively, actually, from disease. Cholera, there are huge cholera. There's actually a global cholera outbreak in the late 1840s that goes all around the world. And it ends up on the Oregon Trail, and cholera is spread from polluted, contaminated water. Well, there's very few, it stretches, very few water holes. So everybody pretty much is exposed to cholera. Lots of people get it. Lots and lots of people die. And so one of the common strategies, when you buried somebody, wolves realized that there's all these dead bodies around the trail. And so wolves would constantly dig up and exhume the bodies and eat them. And so they would bury people in the roadway so that the oxen and all the people passing over would kind of obscure the scent of the bodies, and so that the wolves wouldn't find them as easily. But it was very common to come across graves that were torn up by wolves and body parts scattered all around, and and things like that. So it wasn't all fun stuff, but often for kids were proved very resilient, and they could just kind of shuffle, kind of shrug off a lot of this stuff and keep going. But a lot of adults did kind of have some struggles and stuff. Yeah. And whatever daily life took place on the trail, lots of women hit the trail pregnant and are going to deliver babies on the trail hundreds of miles from the nearest hospital. And that happened all the time on the trail. So, I mean, we talk about people in the past being tough. There were some tough people in the past. Yeah. But yeah.
Oof. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, I could go off on the Oregon Trail all day. It's fun. It's a lot of fun. Other questions? Alex?
This is a general question for either of you.
Yep.
How does general bureauccy of being a professor, trying to get tenure, post-tenure, burnout, publish and perish, how does that affect the final quality of the
Mine's going to be longer. You want to go first?
Well, no, go ahead. Yeah.
So that's a especially complicated question for me, because I was on the job market, and in a 1 year sort of renewable, sort of not renewable position when I was working on this. So Dr. Beltran and I were grad students when we were brought onto the book, and my grad advisor was very clear with the press that we would not start seriously talking about the book and working on it until until both Francisco and I had graduated. Oh, by the way, for the camera, what the question was for tenure and just in general bureaucratic stuff. How did that impact the writing? Since I forgot to say what that was. So we were kind of taking notes and doing all kinds of things, but weren't actually working on the book until we had both graduated. By that point, we were both in not permanent positions. So we were applying to dozens and dozens and dozens of tenure track and one-year jobs and fellowships and so forth while we were also working on the book and, oh, by the way, doing other stuff. Both he and I have what are called monographs, one person, one topic books that we were also working on and that I'm still working on and he's still working on. So I was actually under contract for 2 books for like 3 years and had to put one book off to work on the other one. And so part of the challenge was I was at West Point for 3 years and Dr. Beltran was at 3 different schools. One of them working digitally from California for a fellowship in Michigan because COVID. So we were managing all kinds of shenanigans. And so it was very hard because I had a 40-hour-a-week job plus essentially a 20-plus-hour-a-week job applying for jobs plus, oh, by the way, trying to write that book. And so there was a lot of not sleeping, to be frank. But there was also one of the things we decided to, when we published the book, we decided to, for who we were going to, what's it called when you say dedication words. For the dedication, the first edition, my grad advisor did it to his students, and we decided to dedicate the second to our mentors. And part of the reason, because it was 2 of us working with one of our mentors, but there were a lot of big names in the field who had passed away, and also many of us leaned on our mentors during writing that book. And so I mentioned a whole bunch of the faculty at West Point in my acknowledgments because they really understood when I said, I have to go work on the immigration thing. They kind of went, oh, okay. But there was pressure to get the book done for both me and Dr. Beltran for tenure. But there was also the question of if the book came out before we ended up at permanent jobs, the book wouldn't count for tenure. And so there was a lot of, we didn't delay the book for that, but we all knew that we were juggling one person who had just become a distinguished professor, highest kind of level he could, and 2 of us were like digging the whole time, just trying to kind of stay afloat. And so it is going to count for tenure here because it came out after I got here. But that's one of the dynamics. And some schools might not have, for me, might not have seen this as a full book because there's 3 authors. So that's part of it. Here, everyone's being nice and it's good. But I mean, there is pressure to publish or perish, right? And I think that helped being on the job market, having 2 book contracts and finishing one. But it's also a obscene amount of work, and so it's kind of a little of both. But it's also very hard when you don't have money to travel, to research, and all those things, and you're trying to do that. It's really hard.
Yeah, I guess one of the kind of dispiriting parts of the academic life sometimes is the kind of hierarchy of academic life. There are lots of different kinds of positions, 1-year visiting positions that maybe lead to something else or that don't, and you end up doing another one and another one. And then when you get a position, there's differences between assistant professors and associate professors and full professors, and of course there's differences between institutions as well, right? Like ASU, we're a 4-year kind of teaching-centered school versus say an R1, like we're at UC Santa Barbara and stuff. And at Research One institutions, you generally do have to publish a book each time you want to get promoted. Well, a book is often a 10-year project, and from start to finish. And so it's hard to get to the level of like your advisor or my advisor, or whoever, where you have a cabin in Tahoe. That's the pinnacle
ideal.
of
Yeah.
But there's a lot of stuff in between.
And that is part of the dynamic too, is it's a lot more challenging for folks here at ASU to publish. We do.
Right.
But Dr. Beltran is at Arizona State. Arizona. My God. I was talking to Dr. Key this morning. Oklahoma State, which is an R1. He does not teach nearly as much as I do any given semester. And so he was at non-Research 1 schools when we were doing this book. And so we were both teaching more or less 4 classes a semester while we were writing this. And that's hard. So it's very hard for folks here to have time to go do the research and then, or do even just reading through all those books. I mean, even synthesis, you got to read all the books to get the info to do the synthesis. And it's very hard to actually have enough time to do all of that and teach and try to be a human being with family and you know, maybe occasionally take a weekend off and so forth. And so trying to balance, like work-life balance is something we all, I think, strive for and maybe sometimes do better than others at it. I'm seeing some of my colleagues are like, because they know me. But it's here, it's a different conversation than some other schools like your Rutgers and Duke and A&M and Tech and all those other places. So
I mean, you know, if you're thinking of graduate school, that it's not an easy thing.
No.
And once you're done, it's not an easy thing.
No.
You know, you really have to really hustle and, you know, hope that you're kind of, in some ways, kind of lucky as well
it's
as
totally
being very
luck.
good to you know,
I
find a
was
place
on
that-
the job market for 5 years.
Yeah.
But I'm here now. Yay!
Yeah.
But
Yeah, that was depressing. But,
that was. I know, right?
but it's true, by God.
It's true.
Yeah.
Other questions? Topic specific or not? Yes, Dr. Archer in the front row. Can you speak loudly enough so the mic hears you?
How did you pick your covers?
Oh, that's a question.
Yes, it is. I know the answer.
She knows the answer to mine.
But I don't
This
know
book
if you
has
do.
so much drama. Go
In
for it.
this case, they said, "Hey, here's your cover." I was like, "Awesome!" So I did get to pick the photos. It was kind of cool, you know, this being a group that the ABC Clio, the Greenwood Press, they have a database of images that are already cleared. Either they don't have copyright anymore because they're old, which is great for history, or they've already got the clearance from various places. So for the book, I actually, and I don't have any photos to show you, got to just Google search. They had a search engine. I just searched their photos and be like, like Manifest Destiny, and some stuff would pop up. And there were a few that I wanted to do, and I was like, I wonder if they have it. There's a famous, I think it's Albert Bierstadt painting of the Oregon Trail, and I wanted that. I was like, I wonder if they have it.
The painting of the Oregon.
Yeah,
that one.
Very
Yeah.
romantic, very over the top, sun
Pretty
sinking down,
colors,
giant mountains in the background, and you know, sure enough, they had an image of it. So, and then a lot of older
You
photos.
have to pay to use images in your
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's another thing.
Yeah.
And sometimes you're like, some archives will be like, well, that if you want that, it's $300 for that, the rights to that photo or something. Yeah, and so you end up often spending more money in photos than you'll ever make on the book. But
Yes, I'm pulling one out to show.
so yeah.
So for mine, should I just tell the drama? Dr. Archer wants me to tell the drama. So the first and second edition, I know you guys. It's getting spoiled. So the first edition and the second edition are with a publisher called Routledge, and they got bought out a couple years ago by Taylor and Francis. And this is an important part of the story because that happened while we were working on the book, so the rules changed for covers while we were working on the book, and no one told us. So part of what happened was we had some ideas, some things we wanted to do. Even there's a picture in here that we were thinking of having for the cover. And Routledge told us, first of all, we have a set number of templates that you have to use. And you can't change the colors, you can't change anything. And then the second thing was, and we have 3 like online photo archives that you can look at, and you have to pick a picture from one of those. And most of the archives don't have a lot of good historical images for an immigration book. And so we felt kind of stuck. And we reached out and we asked, I said, okay, if we pay for someone to draw a cover, will that be okay? And Rutledge kind of hemmed and hawed and whatever, and well, that's not in your contract. And eventually they said yes. So we started kind of reaching out and doing stuff, but we were finding this out very late in the game. We didn't have a lot of time. And at that point, we didn't know we were going to have to use a template. That came later. But we we had some artists who were interested and then didn't have time and all this other stuff. And then eventually, Dr. Beltran reached out to one of his students who had done some artwork for, she had made a graphic novel for her final project for his Latinx history class. And he reached out and said, hey, we're working on this book. Do you want to we'll pay you. Will you do the cover? And she said yes. And so we had a bunch of meetings with her. And part of the why this is the cover we ended up with, in part, is because the first edition cover, we wanted to do kind of something with it. So this is a really famous and infamous crossing sign in San Diego, California. And I'll hold it up slightly higher so everyone can see. So we kind of wanted to riff off of this, but maybe talk about how things had changed or show the evolution of this. And so what we talked to her about is what she brought actually to the table. And she herself is Mexican-American and was kind of drawing on her own experiences and her family's experiences. And she said, well, how about I show something with multiple generations? And so we said, yeah, that sounds great. So we drafted a bunch of things. And there's an image that we like better than this one that she did, but we were not allowed to use it. Because the family was walking across the title of the book. Super cool. The colors were fantastic. We're like, oh, this is so great. So we sent it to the press and we said, hey, this is what we want for the cover. And they went, yeah, you can't use that. The title has to be in the specific spot for the thing. And we went, yeah, but this is so much cooler. And they said, we don't care. And oh, by the way, you have to use these templates, and there's like 30 of them, and you have to fit it within this space. So she had to go back and completely redo it, and started kind of futzing with it. And what I ended up doing is taking each template and essentially overlaying her image and figuring out what template worked the best. And this was all within like a month and a half or 2 months time span. So Cara was fantastic, and she was able to kind of get all that done. But part of the reason we're like, about the cover is not because it doesn't look good, it does, but there was one that could have been so much better. And I'm now fighting with the press to try to get them to put it on the website. Because we have a companion website on the book, for the book, with like questions and all kinds of stuff. And so, and we had a lot of image issues. I'm still dealing with them, even though the book's printed. And to talk about money, there's this really, really famous Time magazine issue called The New Face of America. And this is the cover. And what it was, and I see a couple of the older folks in the room are nodding their heads. This was this, they had a computer kind of analyst and graphic artist do an amalgamation of a bunch of different images of people in the United States, and they said, this is the new face of America, right? And this is, by the way, from, I think it's fall 1993. And so in this intro chapter, we're talking about how perceptions of race and immigrants and so forth change. This is in the very beginning of the book. And part of the reason we have this is because a lot of mixed race folks and immigrants talk about this cover, specifically people talking to them about this cover. And this assumption that this is what the quote-unquote new face of America looks like. And, oh, well, you don't have to worry about racism because, you're the new face of America. And so we felt it was very important to put this in. Time magazine wanted 4 figures for this, and we paid it. Whoa. The press were not willing to pay it, and they were willing to pay like a third or a half. And so we paid, and by we I mean Dr. Spiggard, paid out of 2 of us were poor 1-year faculty, we paid out of pocket for that because it was that important, because this image says a lot and it is so important to so many individual experiences. And so that we paid out of pocket because the press was not willing to pay for that image. And so, it's, images are super important. And we also, one of the things we negotiated with the press on was to have the images in color. That was in black and white in the first. We have pie charts for percentages for, the number of people in the U.S. from different areas. And that was in black and white before, which made it hard to see. And we got them to do it in color. And that is a pretty substantial change, especially for an immigration book that talks about race. Yeah.
Yeah, you totally lose the point.
You
of
lose the
picture
point of
when it's
all
black
of
and
that
white.
if, Yes.
Okay, so you talked about how the first book was, the idea is like 2004-ish. So I was born in 2003, and so now it's 2002, and so that's
Do you feel
like
old?
my whole life.
Uh-huh.
And in the most simple way possible, your idea, how has white supremacy changed over that time? Very simple.
As
As
let's okay.
10 words or less.
Layla knows me. Has not had me in class, but knows me. The power structure hasn't, but how it appears and people's willingness to be visible as supportive of it has. I think is the best way to answer that. It's been there. It's been running things. It's been, if not fully running things, like white supremacy has kind of been something that has been very kind of inside a lot of the power structures in the U.S., whether we're talking politics or society, what have you. And it's obvious, if you read the book, it's obvious, it shows up. But part of the reason that the new book took the shape it did is because before it was, you had to work really hard to get people to believe that this is something that is still happening, right? And so it was really, really trying to, no, we promise, this is still here. That's less of a challenge now. It's still important to make it visible and to be clear about how this all works, but people are willing to be very openly there, although not everyone understands what that white supremacy looks like or what some of those things function as. And so it was more about kind of being clear about what that stuff is and what it means. And especially what it means for immigrants, because that's the point of the book. Yeah.
So, definitely.
Kind of following off that is a question for Dr. Hooton, but if Dr. Pierce has something to add as well, I think it certainly is possible. A book about immigration that focuses on race is inherently political. If you are writing a book that is theoretically designed to appeal to the largest audience possible, how do you find, or did you find that you had to think more about how you were presenting things? Was there feedback from the publisher about how to present things? How did you find that experience?
So feedback from the publisher, funny enough, not much. And I think the reason for that, and I'm going to put this on black again, but the reason for that is because there's we were checking each other the entire time, right? So there was a lot of the drafts that went around where there was at least one of us saying, is there a way that we can say this that gives the same information, but perhaps is not rooted in a individual politician's kind of statement or an individual politician's or political ideology's idea, because it's more than that. And it wasn't as much for that reason as it was being as kind of transparent as possible that this isn't just a thing of the moment. And so when we made sure that we weren't just talking about things as a thing of the moment, but more as a result of a series of events, which is what historians often do, it was less of a challenge because it was much easier to just kind of show that this is part of a longer kind of trajectory, right? So to give you an example, one of the arguments that we make that actually I haven't really seen anywhere else, or many other places in history books, but we've seen it in other places, is if you look at how presidents have approached immigration policy, up until President Trump, it was this olive branch that you would use to connect to the other side, which is why you get Ronald Reagan talking about amnesty for undocumented folks. Is because there's this very much like, oh, I want to get the other side to be interested in these other things that I want to do that has nothing to do with immigration, so I'm going to use immigration policy as kind of this way to reach the other side, right? And this is a trend that goes from at least the 50s up until Donald Trump. And then his rhetoric is different. And you can see that it's different because immigration is no longer the olive branch. And so so it's not necessarily about characterizing a politician as a good or a bad or a this or a that, or it's just like, hey, this is something different because this pattern that was going on for, 70 years has now changed. And so it was less about its change, but why and how has that changed and how has that impacted everything from immigration policy to individual experiences. And so that's an example of it wasn't about just beating up on, we also kind of were honest about everything. I mean, there's a reason that Obama's, one of the nicknames was Deporter in Chief. So I mean, we are not being partisan in how we talk about things. We're just, it's there and so I think that made it less of a worry, I guess. I mean, we were still worried, and there was a lot of back and forth. But.
Oh, let's go here, and then Gabby, and then
probably call it.
A few more minutes. We got a few more minutes.
Yeah.
For Dr. Pierce.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at diaries, how do you know if they were telling the truth and they were just making stuff up?
Ooh,
Okay,
that's a good question.
That's a good question. And, not everything that's published is factual. And so one of the ways to kind of think about that is, does it all add up? Does it pass, does it make sense? Does it fit what we know? Now, that doesn't mean that somebody couldn't come up with something, that hasn't been, that's out of the norm or whatever. But let me give you an example, not from this book, but I was researching Indian captivity stories, which very common. In fact, some people call it the first American genre of literature, where people, generally women and children, but not always, sometimes men, are captured by Indians, and they when they get back to civilization, they'll write a book about facing savagery and all these different things. And I was reading one that was like, it just didn't. I mean, it was published, in the, I can't remember, late 1800s, sometime in there, but it just wasn't right. It just didn't add up. He was talking about, the Comanches of Texas, but he was talking about, a temple to Montezuma, and you're like, wait a minute, this is, and you realize it was basically BS, the whole thing,
Not everything published is accurate.
So you just gotta, you've got to be critical of your sources, just like you would with anything. And that's a great point. Even a published book, right? Books have agendas. Books have perspectives. And you as a reader, need to keep in mind, right? Who's this person? Why are they doing? What's their goal? Do I necessarily believe their argument, right? And that's, that should be something obvious to us. But it seems to, people don't always seem to pick up that. Even things like, a Twitter post, right? People are arguing for specific things, and they may or may not be honest about what they're saying, right? Being critical is, even of things you like and generally approve of, is always a good idea, to take a step back and be like, wait a minute,
Just because you agree with something doesn't mean it's right.
But that's a question. Yeah.
So I was wondering, how did you decide, where did you decide to end the book? Like what type of time period? Would you say okay, this is the end, this is where I want to stop it?
That's a great question. Some books you have a firm place where you're like, okay, I'm going to start here, or I'm going to stop here, or something like that. Right, we talk a lot about watershed moments in history. For example, my first book I ended in 1924 with the 1924 Immigration Act that changes a lot of things about well, we can talk about it some more. But anyway, so I ended it there. This one, the publisher really wanted more the 19th century, and they really wanted more of the Trans-Mississippi West. So I kind of focused that, they wanted all the good stuff, basically, right? The reason people like to study the West, they're like, who cares about all that dam building and different things like that, in the 20th
We want the
century.
kids jumping on Lux trampolines.
So mostly I did that, but I did talk about things like, Teddy Roosevelt and, kind of the nascent environmental movement, the national parks and the building of dams. And I did throw, a few references up towards the 20th century and even the late 20th century, I think I end the book talking about, that the West as an environment, as a landscape, well, it's not a homogeneous landscape, but it's mostly a landscape defined by aridity. And aridity is a lot worse now than it has been in the last, 100 or so years. And we've built a civilization. California has, 40 million people, somewhere in that ballpark?
Yeah.
45 million people, something like that.
He's looking at me because I'm from California.
Yeah. We've built, Phoenix has 8 million people.
Yeah.
We've built a whole civilization around water that is not there. And so I talk a lot about, aridity and coming to terms with the West and things like that. And so in that case, I brought it forward a little bit more to our contemporary kind of moment. But mostly I focused on the 19th century.
Sometimes there's clear division points, more thinking about the book I'm working on right now. Sometimes there's obvious beginning and end points. Sometimes you have to choose it simply because, not as much this book, this literally starts pre-contacting, it goes till very recent. But sometimes the choice is you gotta stop somewhere, and so where makes the most sense even if it doesn't entirely end the story. It kind of depends on the project. It's hard.
That's the thing with books too, is you could always find more research. And so there's a certain point where you have to be like,
I'm done.
Yeah.
Because if I find one more piece of paper, I have to add it in, and I can't add it in because it was due 3 weeks ago. I mean, we always meet deadlines. So yeah, it's at some point, not just for the beginning and end dates, but the research, there's a finite period of time,
Yep.
yeah.
What? I think that's a good spot, unless anyone has one last burning question. Okay, Layla. One last burning question.
So I come from two immigrant parents, one from Mexico, one from Kuwait. It's very unique. And you said you have unique stories. Do you have any unique stories in your book about how it affects, immigrants, their immigrant children, so like the DACA kids and the Dreamers, and do you have a lot of how it affects the kids that are here and didn't know life outside of what they came to?
Yeah, so that's one of the ways that this book does some stuff that's different. First of all, even though it's a book about immigration, we also talk regularly about indigenous history and regularly about African American history. And we talk about enslaved folks as, not as immigrants, but people who were forced to move to the United States, obviously, or, the colonies and then the US. And we talk about not just first-gen immigrants and first-gen enslaved folks and all generations of indigenous folks, but also second, third, fourth, even fifth gen, right? And because the experience of a first generation and second generation and third generation are all very different, but they are all connected. But, for example, the experiences of Nisei, second generation Japanese during World War II, are, for example, different than second generation Irish during World War II. And so some of it is generational difference matters. And for immigration, generally speaking, the older generation has a very different thought about what being American means and what being an immigrant means and what learning English means than a second or a third or a fourth gen. And so that's part of what we deal with is not only what is the immigration experience like in the moment, but also then what is life like not only for those immigrants, but their children and their grandchildren. And oh, by the way, immigration and migration are cyclical. So it's also talking about how it's not just one direction, right? And sometimes there's back and forth for many directions. And so people who are coming back and forth from a variety of places. And and recognizing that too. So yeah, and we try to talk about mixed race folks or folks with immigrant backgrounds from different parts of the world in one family, and what does that mean? And yeah, undocumented folks, and some folks are are undocumented, but oh, by the way, their parents married in the U.S. and one of them is, and I mean, there's all that, there's messiness, and so we try to make sense of the messiness in a way that students can understand, but to not ignore the fact that it is highly messy, and that's kind of part of the experience too, if that makes sense to everyone.
All right. Thanks, guys. You have earned your extra credit.
I know I can stay after, and if anyone has any questions, and my door is always open if you want to come talk about this stuff or see the book or what have you, and yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.